and welcome to the third episode of Basha's Thoughts. Today I'd like to talk about what is real. I'd like to start talking about what we usually think and imagine as real, what society has somehow programmed into us a little bit. Then I'd like to talk about what science actually has to say about that. And then finish off maybe by talking about more personal experiences and spirituality and what reality is. So, to start with, the first thing that we often think about when we think about what is real is the tangible. In other words, that which we can touch, see, measure, especially that which is explicit. And so we can really say, well, it's here, you can see it, you can touch it. So that which can be grasped by our senses, or even our extended senses, like radio frequencies, for instance, we would say that they are real, even though we cannot really see them and perhaps not perceive them. But we can create machines that can measure them. So we would say that they are real as well. We can use them. Science and the scientific mindset has for a long time been based around materialism and reductionism. And these have become very valuable because they have been very useful for us. Science has taught us many things. And probably because of this, we do tend to value the measurable a little bit more than that which we cannot really measure. So society has been influenced by this scientific mindset in the rules or laws that we have, in what we tend to value. And when we can measure something, we will usually say, well, it's real and it's valuable. When it comes to more intangible things like qualities, for instance, the quality of life or of an experience, things like that we cannot quite measure very well. And so they tend to be somehow less real. And society tends to give them less value in different ways. Think about, for instance, a person who gets sick, is feeling very bad, goes to the doctor, and then the doctor starts to measure a bunch of things. Takes the blood pressure, maybe does a scan, and a bunch of different measurements, things that we can objectively see. And they come up with nothing. They say, well, there's nothing wrong with you. It's all in your head. It's all psychological. It's not real. But the suffering is real. So society has this tendency to undermine sometimes and even discriminate that which is not tangible, that which cannot be measured, at least at the moment. So that's why for a long time, fibromyalgia, for instance, has been sort of discriminated against, and people who got it felt really bad because they felt, well, it's in my mind, I'm creating this, everyone tells me that, nobody really believes that it exists, maybe I am crazy. And so qualities have not been highly valued in our society. And I think that this has been related to this sort of scientific mindset, you could say. But here's the thing. How can we make science even more scientific? What would be the next step to make science even more scientific? What does science actually have to tell us regarding what is real? So, as I mentioned, two kind of big things about science have been that it is materialistic and that it tends to be reductionistic. So what does this mean? Well, materialistic means that we believe that there is a material world out there, This is an objective, independent world, made out of matter, out there meaning independent of consciousness. So this seems like a very natural supposition to make. But when you start to examine it, you realize that, well, you cannot actually prove this in any way. In fact, you could even argue that not only can you not prove it, but actually it looks like we're getting more and more experiential and even scientific type of data that seems to tell us that this is actually not the case. And if you want to be as scientific as possible and you really want to know what is real, then you're kind of dealing with ontology, right? What exists? What is real? What is everything made of? So if you want to know that, then you shouldn't sort of start with a supposition that tells you, well, we have a materialistic, independent universe here, and it's independent of consciousness. We shouldn't be making such suppositions when we cannot prove them, and they are not necessary to make. One might wonder, but how does science show us that this might not be the right way to go? Well, if you go to quantum theory, for instance, it's interesting because even a long time ago, there were people who were starting to create sort of thought experiments that were based on quantum theory. So two of them are very interesting because they have just very recently, in the last years, been shown experimentally. Before, they were just thought experiments. And now we have actually experimental proof of them. So one is Wigner's friend. And this experiment kind of shows us that, there might not be an objective physical universe out there. It's only when you choose a perspective that it sort of comes into being. It's not like it's always out there. What seems to be more fundamental are the superpositions, the states of superposition that we have in quantum theory, where you have potentialities. So you don't have outcomes, you have potential outcomes, and you have many potentialities. So is something here or there? Yes, it is here and there at the same time, in a state of superposition. So these states seem to be more fundamental. These potentialities seem to be more fundamental than an objective physical universe out there. Indeed, they only appear when you take a perspective. Another experiment like that basically shows you a very similar situation is Wheeler's choice experiment. That too has recently been shown experimentally, and it leads to the same kind of idea that, this objective-looking universe only seems to come into place when you choose a perspective, when you choose a context and a perspective. So we have these things from quantum theory showing us that maybe there is no objective material universe out there, independent of consciousness. So maybe it's not such a great idea to start with this materialistic supposition. Also, we have reductionism. And also, the quantum theory seems to suggest that maybe the reductionist thought is not exclusively the best way to describe things. Reductionism is when you believe that if you kind of find the smallest building block, like say a brick, then you can figure out how everything is built, like how you built a whole house out of bricks. because you know how they interact, at least in theory. Well, this reductionist view has a lot of challenges. You have complex systems that kind of display behaviors that you would not expect because they are so simple, such simple systems, and yet we have complex behaviors from them. And of course, in the quantum theory, we also have things that suggest a different type of order, because how something moves is not really determined with forces of push and pull that are local. How a thing moves is actually determined by the context, so by the whole. So the whole influences the movement of the part. So this suggests a more holistic approach with the holographic types of orders, where you have the whole in every part in some sense, and every part is in the whole, and the whole is in every part. So a holistic, holographic type of order. Perhaps the best way for science now to evolve would be to drop the materialist assumption and move beyond, expand beyond reductionism. That could perhaps also lead to some positive influences on society, because maybe then we would also not just automatically value just that which we can explicitly measure. Okay, so what is science saying? What am I saying that science is saying? I'm saying that based on quantum theory and based on the latest experiments, it looks as though the real part, that which is real in quantum theory, are the potentialities, not this explicit objective universe. That is not always there, out there, but what is are the potentialities. So it is not the measurable part that is real. It is that which is, in a sense, intangible, because it's a potentiality. Also, there's another way of looking at things when it comes to science and physics, because actually if you look at whatever it is you look at, you realize that that thing is actually defined by its relation to everything else. So if you're looking for reality, and if you're looking for an ontology, you soon realize that everything is defined in terms of everything else. It doesn't have its own sort of inner existence in these descriptions. So even the smallest particles that might seem as the building blocks in some sense, even the quarks or the electrons, as soon as they meet up with an antiparticle, they are no longer electrons or quarks. So everything changes. So everything is defined in its relationship to everything else, and everything changes. Here's an interesting thing. What if, instead of trying to look for a thing that is basic, maybe we should go over to a process ontology? So it's not an ontology where something is and it moves. Instead, there is movement, and that is sort of basic. Well, then we have everything is described in its relationship to everything else. All of that becomes just processes that are defined in terms of other processes. So it becomes sort of like a mesh of processes, but it sort of looks a little bit ontologically empty. If we really want to find the answers to what it is this thing behind, what is the ontology, the real reality, what are we really talking about? Well, then we should not be making assumptions like materialism, we should be open to moving beyond them, because it seems to be the case that there might not be an objective universe out there. Okay, so this is a little bit about science. Now, what about your personal experience, and what about spirituality? If you think about yourself, the I is something that is pretty much intangible. So what is the most real to you? Well, in a way, you are most real to you. Your existence is most real to you. And then you have experiences, and sure, they can feel very real. But who are you? If we're looking for an ontology, what are you? Who are you? Well, you are not really explicit. You are not really measurable. The I in you is not really tangible. So it looks like the I is not really tangible. And if we look at what is valuable, what is important to us, at first it may seem that explicit things and outcomes are quite valuable to us. But then as we look a little bit closer, we realize that it's actually not the thing that we value, it's what the thing does for us internally that we value. We don't really value a good meal. The meal is good only because it makes us feel good. So it's the making us feel good. If there were no making us feel good, well then there would be no value to a good meal. We wouldn't even call it good. So what we're actually looking for are those internal positive experiences, the nice states of being, the happiness, joy, peace. All of those things is what we actually value. So that's interesting, because in society we have been having quite the opposite. We've been valuing that which is tangible, that which is measurable, and devaluing that which is intangible. And yet we seem to be intangible, and that which we value seems to be intangible. So what is real and what is important? That which is somehow intangible, from our experiences at least. And then if we sort of examine ourselves even further, and we look at, well, let me see what my experiences are like. What parts are there to me, in a sense? Well, we have our perceptions. We can perceive things. We can look at things, see them. We can touch them, hear them. And what does this relate to? What kind of a sense do we get through our perceptions? So when you perceive, you explicitly experience the sense of being present, right? I am here now. I can feel the chair. I can see the walls. I can hear the sounds outside. So it brings me a sense of presence, an explicit sense of presence. So it seems like perceptions provide an explicit sense of presence, space. Yeah? What else do we have? Well, we have our thoughts, so we can perceive and we can think. And what do thoughts give us? Well, they provide memories, for instance. You can remember things, and you can have expectations, and you can think about things, and you can know things, and you can understand things, and you can sort of order things because you have your memories and such. So it gives us a sense of time. So we have an explicit sense of time in some way because of our ability to think. And awareness, of course. So we know that we are here, present. So we can explicitly know that we are here, present, because we sense and see here. Okay, it seems to provide a way of being aware and a sort of sense of time. What else do we have? Well, we have our emotions, right? Our feelings and emotions, different types of emotions. And we can have desires and we can be afraid of things. And so we have an explicit direction. We have an explicit way of knowing our preferences. We prefer one thing over another. But when can we prefer those things explicitly? Well, only when we have a perspective, right? Only when I am in my body do I then start to perceive some things as good for me, other things as not so good for me. So good and bad, fears and desires, these things, it's this drive, because our emotions give us our value. Why is something good? Why is something valuable? So it gives us a direction. This is like the engine of everything, like that which drives the process. And interestingly enough, if you look at spirituality, these three things, the perceptions, thoughts, and emotions, are explicit examples of our inner nature. And our inner nature is said to be, and to find out what it is, what you actually do is you go from the more explicit to the less explicit. So for instance, if you go in your mind, you go from a particular thought, and then you go deeper to knowing, and then you go deeper to understanding, and then you go deeper to being aware. So you're kind of moving away from the explicit, and it becomes less and less tangible in a sense, less precise. It's larger, more open. So if you do that with your thoughts, you end up in awareness, just being aware. If you do that with your perceptions, actually you end up going through beauty. And that's a mixture of bliss and perceptions, and or you could say emotions. And then you move into presence. So perceptions give you presence, or they give you being. So you have awareness and being. And this is actually what we very much feel is real. I know that I am. I know that. And then I might misperceive things, and I might not know how things work, but I sort of know that I am. I might not know what I am, but I know that I am. That is sort of the most real part to us. That is what is real. Being, presence, and awareness. And what else? Well, if you look at the emotions and you go backwards, where do you end up? You end up in unity, love, peace, bliss. So these are the three, you could say, characteristics that are all one and the same. And they are very interesting because they are not three different characteristics. And if you think about process ontology, we were talking about that regarding the scientific part, then in a way you can see this as a process. Instead of, there is not a one being that knows and is blissful. It is not something that exists somewhere. It is, of course, infinite. It cannot have any limitations on it, because a limitation makes it more and more explicit. So it's free of limitations. But the thing is, it's not even a thing in a sense. And so this is where we have reality, you could say, because that's what we feel is the most real. However, it's not just that. It's not just this being or this, it's a process, you could say. And the process goes like this. The process, you could imagine as a metaphor, the process moves from this infinite being presence, knowing, awareness, right? And bliss, it moves into and becomes more and more explicit, and it creates these apparent explicit worlds. But as it does that, it's kind of unfolds into the explicit. So the reality of it, the I, is sort of being lent to the parts, to the processes. This is how you get an ontology for what otherwise seemed like just a mesh of processes where everything is described or defined in terms of everything else. So this is how you sort of imbue the mesh of processes, the explicitly looking types of things, with a reality. And then, but this is only one part, and then it also goes back from the explicit parts into being, the infinite being. So you can look at it that way. People who have spoken of it in these kinds of terms are, for instance, David Bohm, and he did this in physics when he was talking about the quantum theory. And so he called the different parts the implicit and the explicit. Of course, the thing is that we're looking at a process ontology, so we're not actually saying that these two different things exist and we go from one to the other and then we transform back to the first one. So it's what exists is this movement, and this movement has this characteristic. So this is why you have both. You don't just have this infinite being. It actually generates this apparent world, which is borrowing its reality from the infinite, but it looks explicit. And why? Why is this created? Because it is a movement. It is not a thing. It is not an infinite just being. It's like a movement, of course. I am saying movement, but it's not a movement in time, because time only appears in the explicit, on the very end part of the explicit. That's where time, that's where space appear. So this is a metaphor in that sense, which is not perfect. We're talking about a movement from the infinite to the explicit. And why? Why does this happen? What is it that drives it? What is it that makes it happen? Love. That is the drive. The bliss, love part, you could say, of the infinite, when it becomes more and more specific, that is the part that gives a direction. That is that which gives us an arrow of time, in evolution. We haven't quite figured that out in physics yet, because actually many of the fundamental equations of motion, like the Schrödinger equation in quantum theory, they are unitary transformations. So they could just as easily go backwards in time. So there's no real event happening in them. But where do we get that from? Well, we get that from love, actually. Of course, you would use other words in physics. But do you get the idea? Because it is love that when it becomes sort of fractionized, when it becomes more and more explicit, that it becomes desires and then fears. So we can be driven by fear or desire. So these are more explicit things. But where does it come from? Bliss. It comes from bliss and love. So that is the driver of the universe in that sense. Okay, so what is real? Well, it seems to me that the most real parts, when it comes to our experience and when it comes to spirituality, have to do with the intangible. And it seems to me that when you look at physics, you kind of get a similar type of picture, because it seems to be the potentialities of quantum theory that are the real part. And the objective universe, the explicit, is only a consequence that appears whenever you have a perspective. So whenever you are in the perspective of a human being or whatever it is, then you have your preferences that are explicit. And whenever you have a well-defined context of your experimental setup and a perspective, that you can also create an objective outcome. So, I think I'm going to start wrapping this up for today, but that's kind of the main part, that maybe we are now ready to, even in physics, even in science, start moving away from a purely materialistic and reductionist view to one that also incorporates in some ways the intangible, because it seems as though this intangible is more valuable to us and more real, actually. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so you can always send me a message if you'd like, and then we can talk about other things or things related to this in another podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to our next meeting.